holy wars of great import, a time of tumult, tragedy, and violence, a clash over who would control not just the future of organized religion, but the resources that came in that region. Today, my friends, we are discussing the Crusades. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Desks and Dorks. My name is Kyle. I am the Dork. A couple of very important things. If you like the work that we do here and you'd like to support us, the best ways to do so are to join our Patreon, where you get an RPG every month, your name in the credits, and early access to Desks and Dorks content. You can also, of course, get our PDFs over at itch.io, and you can get physical copies from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. Now, with that out of the way, I have to bring up a couple things here. One, I was trained as a Eurocentric medievalist. That means that usually I stick to Western Europe, specifically where my training was focused on. However, because the Crusades are a true international conflict, I have had to venture out. I have brought in a lot of sources, many of whom are Arabic in nature as well, to get a little more of a nuanced view, but I think it's important to bring up my bias and my training before we go into this. If you're going to lean into the horrific stuff that a member of the Crusades would have done, or that battles during the Crusades would have encompassed, I would highly encourage you to look into either safety tools, communication tools, whatever you want to call them. Just make sure that your players are having a good time. Make sure everyone feels comfortable and safe at your table. I think that's important as game masters. And finally, I have to address two major difficulties. You see, the Crusades have kind of a reputation of hate. And I don't mean to say that the war itself has a reputation of hate, although I do think that's certainly part of it. I mean in the modern sense. Those of you who have followed me for any length of time know that I believe that you cannot remove politics from history and historical retellings. I think it's an important thing, and in many cases a weapon used to shape the narrative by other individuals. In recent years, the Crusades, the images of the Crusades, and the history surrounding them have been co-opted by members of white supremacist movements here in the United States and abroad. This has made the studying of the Crusades a pretty difficult thing because, at least in the pop cultural sense, or in the modern sense, there are a lot of individuals who are spreading misinformation about the Crusades, about the time period, and about the resources that you can find therein, and that makes the field of study harder from a layperson's perspective. Not everybody has had the benefit of professional historical training or professional media literacy and the ability to suss out what is and is not a reliable source. That has made the armchair enjoyment of the Crusades, I think, a little bit more difficult. I get those people in my comments actually quite a lot, usually when we're trying to present nuanced, i.e. non-Western viewpoints on things or perspectives that don't include white people in Europe. It's a kind of an issue, and unfortunately, it's one that this group of people and this particular field of study really does struggle with. And I bring it up here because it has made the finding of information more difficult, not just for myself, but I think for people in general. Again, this is directed squarely at the people that either say Deus Vult unironically or get offended when you say Deus Vult ironically. Again, I say Deus Vult jokingly when, cereal falls on my foot at the grocery store, and I'm like, I am going to create a crusade against Fruity Pebbles. That's funny, but there are legitimately some people, I went to school with some of them, that were legitimately offended when people said that in a joking manner. These are the type of folks that I'm talking about. Again, there is a vested interest in white supremacist movements of sort of linking back to a quote-unquote warrior heritage and using that as not just a way to sort of hype themselves up, but to give an excuse as to why other individuals from different countries and different faiths need to be eradicated. It's an important thing, I think, to bring up before we engage with the Crusades in a reasonable and earnest fashion. And of course, I have to talk about pop culture. The Crusades, more than any other conflict in the Middle Ages, any of them, more than the 100 Years' War, more than Robin Hood, more than anything, has been the biggest carrier of, foundation of medieval pop cultural representation. Every part about the Crusades is wrapped up in the pop cultural representation of the Middle Ages, right? When we talk about Robin Hood, why is Richard the Lionheart missing in Robin Hood? He is on a crusade. Why is it that we're fighting all these tournaments to raise money? For the crusade. Where do the knights go in Ivanhoe? Oh, they were on crusade. You get what I'm trying to get at here. And this has not been eased in recent years, although I am a big fan of Kingdom of Heaven. It's like one of my favorite movies. There are some massive historical inaccuracies in that film that I think have gone on to create some harmful opinions of, or like wrong depictions of leaders and events within the Crusades. Again, I love the movie. The movie's fantastic. But movies like Kingdom of Heaven and modern media have really shaped an understanding of the Crusades that is, frankly speaking, lacking in nuance, one-dimensional, and even potentially harmful to engaging with this as a field of honest-to-God, real historical study. And I'm going to do my best to sort of work our way through those things. Again, I am a fan of all of these films, by the way. You don't need to make a movie historically accurate, I think, to make it enjoyable and fun to watch, to have a good time with it. However, it does matter for us as game masters if we are trying to pull real historical information from this time period into the role-playing games that we craft. Both of these things are so important that I have to mention them now before we begin the Crusades in earnest. And again, one last thing to touch on. The Crusades have in many ways become the sort of mascotification or mascot for the idea of savagery during the Middle Ages. Again, harmful stereotypes. This is a time period that has a lot of nuance and a lot of different perspectives that we're going to try to discuss here as best we can. Also, I'm just really proud of this one still because I custom did this in Photoshop and I'm very pleased with myself. Mickey Mouse is this way for me now, forever. All right, with that out of the way, a couple other things. One, the Crusades are a very long time period. They stretch from 1096 all the way to 1291 BCE, and as a result, there is a lot going on. This is a true international conflict. I have done my best to provide this as a great primer, again, a sort of historical buffet, but we're not going to be going in depth on everything. It is entirely plausible and possible that I'm going to miss some stuff that others might deem important to the Crusades. However, I do believe this is a pretty good primer in general if you're looking to make the Crusades or Holy Wars of their scope a main facet of your tabletop games. With that out of the way, let's start with some misconceptions. And the first one is that the Crusades were mainly a religious conflict. Now, this is already where I can hear some very furious keyboards clicking, but let me cook for a second. Now, I have long campaigned for the importance of religion as an aspect of Middle Age culture, or the medieval culture, however you want to say that, right? Our low fantasy video has an entire section on how I think you should use religion in a game and on its importance in displaying and portraying religion as not one-dimensional, either good or evil, but as nuanced as the people that follow it. I will never tell you that the religious movements of the Middle Ages are not important, both culturally, politically, socioeconomically, and just in general, right? I'll never say that. However, the idea that the pure scope of the Crusades is a purely religious conflict is in falsehood. It really just does not work. Now, I will tell you that the rank and file, the average soldier, the man-at-arms or peasant, they're motivated by religion. That individual probably does care quite a bit about the teachings of Christ and might be moved or convinced to go on crusade as a way of displaying or portraying their fervor and their love, both for their faith and their desire to see that brought onto the world. However, that is not the main cause of the Crusades. Pious though the knights and men-at-arms might be, religious though the rank and file who make up these armies, and even some of the commanding officers were, that's not the main issue. The main issue here, as it is in most modern warfare, is money, money, money. And I want you to consider this. One of the best ways that we know about this is in the logistics of the Crusade. I need you to consider and understand that a universal fact of the Middle Ages is that travel was dangerous, time-consuming, expensive, and risky. At best, you were hoping that the journey would take a little bit longer than you thought it would, that you would come back intact with your goods and your health to show for it. However, this was often not the case. And many issues persisted throughout the Middle Age, things like bandits, roving companies of mercenaries, nobles looking to extort, traders who were either unprepared, unwilling, or unguarded, enough to, withstand such attempts at tribute, as well as just, Mother Nature, disease, animals, terrible terrain, freak weather, all kinds of things could totally and completely derail a voyage, a journey, a wagon train, what have you. And so, not only is travel cumbersome and expensive and risky, it is all of those things at once, and an individual, no matter how they feel about the Lord, is probably not going to make it to Jerusalem and to the Crusader states in one piece, and thus the crusade is facilitated by, organized by, and essentially organized for the wealthy elite. Again, I want you to take into account that this is literally over 3,000 miles from London to Jerusalem, and while you might be able to go from, say Anatolia or places in Greece potentially, maybe even parts of the Holy Roman Empire or France, to get to the Holy Land in order to actually, participate in the Crusades, it is still over 3,000 miles at a time where a journey 1/10 this length is treacherous at best. All of these things matter, and they speak to the importance of who is organizing this campaign. And again, that's not to say of the exorbitant costs of the trip itself, even if everything does go well. One of the things that we take into account, or fail to take into account, as modern people, is that logistics is the thing that wins wars, full stop. It's why the Romans were great, it's why the United States military has been able to stay dominant for as long as it has, and it's why this trip was not just so fraught with peril, but so freaking expensive. When you have a medieval army, you have what are called hangers-on, or camp followers. These would have included craftsmen, bodyguards, bowyers, leather workers, blacksmiths, and the people that are used to facilitate the care of your animals. And that's not just to say that the knights themselves also enjoyed eating, right? This is a massively, exorbitantly expensive endeavor, to the point that going on crusade did almost bankrupt, and in some cases did bankrupt nobles and small kingdoms. Seriously, this is not the endeavor of a regular person. And again, while faith can get you far, in this case, faith is not getting you further than you can march on your stomach. And we haven't even touched on these bastards, these horrific, horrifying creatures. Horses eat a metric ton. I don't think you understand, as a regular lay person, how much a war horse would consume over the course of a march and in the aftermath of a battle. It is so significant. I have grown up, fortunately, in a pretty big farming community. I am aware of what a regular workhorse eats on a daily basis. If you are traveling with a company of 500 to 3,000 knights, good lord, the food bill alone would be enough to bankrupt a small company. It is in fact such a huge deal that it is mentioned not just in the Crusades as part of the exorbitant costs. By the way, Enrico Dandolo, who is the Doge of Venice, don't worry, we will get to him eventually, uses a separate column for the expenses generated by Crusader knights that he transports, and that column is not for the knights, it's not for their squires, it's not for their hangers-on, it's for just the horses. And again, this is mentioned in another important military and historical text, The Art of War, where Sun Tzu himself mentions that horses are a huge freaking problem for the army on the go. All of this is to say that just getting to the Holy Land, not fighting in the Holy Land, not holding the Holy Land, getting to it alone is a astronomically difficult economic proposition at best. And now we have to think just a little bit about why these people would do this. Again, we talked about blacksmiths, we talked about camp followers, but who is shouldering that cost? Who is the person who is organizing this force into the Holy Land to get to Jerusalem? And when you look at who is doing the organizing, the mustering, the logistics, the funding, it is not the common man. It is people like the monarchy, it is individuals of high power and status within the church, and it is the nobility, particularly the upper echelons of the nobility, those who would be closest to ruling or who control such powerful feudal holdings that they may as well be small kingdoms unto themselves. This is not a landed knight with money. This is not a wealthy, well-to-do merchant. This is the 1% of the 1% of the medieval world. And now we have to ask ourselves an additional question. Why? Why would these people bother bankrolling such a risky, expensive, time-consuming expedition. Now, here is where most people's understanding and nuance of the Crusades as a period goes to seed. Some of you are probably thinking, well, duh, we love God. That makes sense. Why wouldn't we do that? And there may have been maybe one of those ultra elite who truly believed in their heart of hearts that this was a religious cause. But that's not why. And much like it is in the modern day, when a wealthy elite who controls culture, politics, and industry wants something, it's because it's going to give them fat stacks of land, of wealth, and power. If you don't believe me, let's take a look at some of the most successful crusades and the benefits that were derived from the individuals that won those crusades. Again, the why. How do we get this money? How do we get this power? How do we get this land? Let's talk about the Albigensian Crusade of 1206 to start with. This was one of the single most successful crusades in the Crusader period. Now, if you haven't heard of the Albigensian Crusade, you may have heard of the Cathars, which were a religious heretical sect of Catholics in southern France. Yes, one of the most successful crusades of the period doesn't take place in the Middle East at all. It takes place in Europe proper, and there's some reasons why. Over a 20-year period, the French monarchy, with the help of the Catholic Church, eradicates not just all of the Cathar holdings, they burn several villages, they torch a bunch of fiefs, but they also destroy the county of Toulouse and its structure of governance, right? They take out all of the ruling class in the Duchy of Toulouse, allegedly under the guise of this being religious war, under the guise of rooting out the heretic, of rooting out the Cathar. However, that's not why they did it. And we have a pretty clear understanding of why the French monarchy did this. Now, in order to actually talk about this, we have to bring up geography, but you have to understand that France as an entity, France as a medieval country, did not fully exist as you and I understand it in the modern parlance. No. France was, for the most part, if you were going to call it that, the section around the city of Paris known as the Ile-de-France, which was the region that was personally controlled by the descendants of the Carolingian dynasty. These individuals, over a period of several hundred years, and using a mixture of shrewd diplomacy, economic and mercantile maneuvering, actual crude battle tactics, and outright skullduggery and, unalivement of the creative persuasion, were able to slowly gain control of the rest of the country. The county of Toulouse, at the time of the Crusade, was the last real holdout against the French monarchy's power. And with the Crusade, the French monarchy saw an opportunity to take out their largest rival. The county of Toulouse was not only militarily very, very threatening to the church, not only was it militarily threatening to the crown of France, but because of its location right there on the Mediterranean, it had access to ports and mercantile trade that made it not just one of the most militarily powerful and strategically important regions in what would become modern-day France, but also one of the biggest economic producers of the time. The Albigensian Crusade is essentially a smokescreen by which the French monarchy, with the assistance of the Catholic Church, is able to uproot the county of Toulouse, take it over, burn out opposition root and stem, and subsume this area into France proper and under the control of the newly enlightened, or shall we say, strengthened at the very least, French monarchy. This is one of the most successful crusades. Again, it doesn't take place in the Holy Land, it takes place in Europe, and it takes place for financial reasons. But surely we can also talk about the sack of Constantinople, another of the Crusade's most quote-unquote successful battles. And for us to understand that, we need to really break down a couple hundred years, or actually almost close to about 1,000 years of history and estrangement between Italy and between Constantinople, or the Byzantine Empire rather, who has sort of treated Italy, particularly in the Middle Ages, as pawns in a scheme of international mercantile trade and imperialist expansion. Now, chief among those city-states that Constantinople uses and abuses isn't just a minor one, it's the city of Venice. Now, Venice at the time of the sack of Constantinople is led by a man named Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, a man who, by all accounts, was not just blind, but also probably a supervillain. And I mean that Almost literally, the guy was fueled essentially by two things: a lust for money and power, and a seething hatred for the Byzantines. The crusade, which essentially he uses as an excuse to strong-arm several thousand crusaders onto ships. He then strands those crusaders in the Bay of Constantinople without shelter, and he says, hey, unless you can pay me, I'm not going to take you the rest of the way to the Holy Land. The people of Constantinople add to this insult with additional injury, stranding them and essentially insulting them in the bay for a while, until finally, hungry, tired, hot, and egged on by the promise of greater loot and religious fervor, because remember, Enrico Dandolo doesn't care, but some of the rank and file do believe in the cause of Christendom. Egged on by these factors, they sack the city. They destroy Constantinople, doing irreparable damage to the Byzantine Empire. It's never the same after this point. And not only that, but Enrico Dandolo never makes it to the Holy Land. He breaks off with a segment of those knights slated for the Holy Land. And where do they go? They just keep raiding the wealthy, underprotected areas of the Byzantine Empire. They never make it on a crusade. They truly spend the rest of their time looting and pillaging from Christian lands. Again, this is not an area or a time brought up for religious excuses or religious reasoning. These are men motivated by power, money, and a desire to gain land. And it's that third one, that third aspect of land, by the way, just another illustration of our lovely friends over at the Byzantine Empire, but it's this aspect of land that I really want to touch on because we have to talk about the Crusader states. One of the things that I think people don't fully understand is just how separated, scattered, and territorial, factional this area of the Mediterranean was at the time. Now, not only did you get to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the land around Jerusalem itself, but as additional Christian armies are showing up, they're striking up alliances with the Muslims in those territories or with one another, and they're carving out individual lands, kingdoms for themselves. And this desire for land is actually a huge deal. At the time of the Crusades, by the way, this is a really great job of illustrating some of the smaller holdings, both Christian and Muslim, in the region. But one of the big things that we have to talk about is the social structure of feudal Europe at this time. It was very difficult, if you were an individual of low birth and low resources, to make your way up, or even not vertically, but even horizontally, laterally, on the social ladder. It was tough to make a play at being something other than what you were born as. And as a result of this, if you went on crusade, not only were you promised a portion of the plunder, plunder that would be a life-changing fortune in some cases, but there was an opportunity to gain land. There wasn't this level of rigid social hierarchy because you got the ability to fight, and the church was looking for anybody that could fight for these types of battles, whether they were doing so for religious reasons, which some of the clergy were, or realistically they were looking for individuals to help push their agenda to gain money, wealth, and land. And part of that desire, part of that deal is, they got some land, but guess what? If you were a soldier and you played your cards right during the crusade, you could also get some land. Add to this the fact that it was tough to sort of make the kinds of financial and territorial gains that you could make in the Holy Land, but you couldn't really make them in Europe. The church was, at the time, trying desperately to enforce a sort of truce between the knighthood and between the common folk. This meant, and particularly, by the way, between knights and other knights. Now, the church was spotty at best about enforcing this policy, but it did mean that it was more difficult for you as a fighting individual to take land and take wealth from your European neighbors. But the church didn't care if you took it from some foreign Muslim, some foreign Jewish person far away. What did they care? You were over there doing God's work in air quotes, so why would they stop you? All of a sudden, if you were an individual of low or even reasonable birth, you had the opportunity to gain all kinds of things. You could effectively gain your own fief, gain your own castle, or at the very least, make out with enough plunder to live at a layer of comfort and a level of indulgence that you could have never seen at home in Europe. So even if you were not of the great wealthy, the 1% of the 1% of the medieval population that we're talking about, the people who would lead these individuals for financial gain. Even if you weren't that group, you still had a vested financial interest in going to the Holy Land, in sacking the Holy Land, and in taking what you could. Now, we can argue all day that, yeah, you slapped Jesus on the tin, but let's be real here. If there is a god that most of these crusaders, particularly those that are in command, are serving, it's not Christ, it's Mammon. To go along with this idea of serving Mammon, the lord of greed or the devil of greed, rather than God, it's also where we get the myth of the third or the second son on crusade. There is a long-standing sort of misnomer, and it's not something that I see very much anymore, about like nobility sending their lesser children, their second and their third sons, off to battle, off to combat the enemy, in order to gain their name, in order to sort of gain power and wealth, in order to gain prestige and glory, and also the copious amounts of money and monetary goods that come along with it. Now, this is a nice little fantasy, and it's true that in some places, especially because of the rigid social structure in some areas of feudal Europe, that probably did occur, but let's be real here. Any member of the nobility, the landed gentry, the higher up, that had a vested economic interest in the region, which is, cough cough, all of them had a potential economic interest in the region, but those that had the means in order to pursue that interest would have gone to the Holy Land and most likely would have gone on crusade. But this is where that myth stems from. But the real reason that people tried to carve out their own little empires in the Holy Land is that doing so gives you unfettered access to trade. It is a geyser by which you can literally print medieval money and copious amounts of valuable, important, and critical goods. I want you to take a look once again at this map of the Crusader states in the time of 1200. Now, one of the things that you have no doubt noticed is that all of these Crusader states are either built directly onto the Mediterranean or are close enough to the Mediterranean that they can be accessed very easily by river or road. Now, this is presumably because you would like to get reinforcements from Europe and the crusading powers back in the West. However, when we zoom out, we see a much better and more important picture, a holistic view of the kinds of trade networks that the medieval powers in this region would have gained access to by carving out their own lands in the Holy Land. Seriously, you have access to Anatolia, to Sicily, to Egypt, and you can do all of these things in the Mediterranean while bypassing Constantinople. Something to take into account is at the time of the Crusades, Constantinople had a brisk trade, not just with Western Europe, but with the East, and they acted as a kind of wealthy middleman, not just benefiting from their position on the straits, the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, but being able to take finished goods and imports from the East and export them to the West, and then taking imports from the West and exporting them to the East. They took a chunk out of the profits every single time they did this, and having your own area in the Crusader states meant that not only did you gain access to a vast trade network by sea, not only did you gain access to the markets in those trade networks, again, Anatolia, Sicily, Egypt, that you could use to sell those goods, but you now had access to the East yourself and could make the kinds of profits that the Byzantines were making without the Byzantines taking a cut. Now, I'm not saying it was not difficult. I am saying, however, that to any, even the least shrewd economic minds of this time, this was a gamble worth taking, and it was a bet that they would pay with any number of human lives, whether those lives were Christian, Muslim, or Jew. It did not matter so long as they got what they wanted, and for a couple hundred years, a lot of them got very rich and very powerful on the backs of this holy war. All of this to say that the risk, the expense, the logistical weight, the opportunity both economically, politically, and socially that taking over the Holy Land offered means that truthfully, if we are going to unpack the Crusades and use them, there has to be an economic, political reason behind them, not purely a religious one. Or to summarize, actually, I got a comment from one of those people who gets offended when someone says Deus Vult, basically saying that this is dumb and comparing it to the idea of us eventually going to Mars. This is a real comment, by the way. I'm paraphrasing, but this is a real comment that I got in one of the videos. And I actually realized it's kind of brilliant, but for the opposite point that they're trying to make. They're right. The average person, the rank and file, the individual is kind of like an astronaut going to Mars. Somebody who is interested in furthering human scientific progress, in doing something noble for reasons that are bigger than themselves, or for things that they genuinely in their heart and soul believe are the right things to do. And that's what leads them to make a dangerous, expensive, risky journey that potentially has real reasons. However, the people funding those journeys are, in general, more interested in their own self-aggrandizement, or more accurately, in the economic, political, and power opportunities that such an endeavor offers them. And so, we begin with this first and perhaps greatest misconception about the Crusades. The second major misconception that we have to address is that the Crusades were brought on by Muslim/Arab violence. I think we've already done a pretty good job of establishing that there are clear economic and political, socioeconomic and socio-political reasons and motivations for going to the Holy Land and going on crusade. However, I want to bring this up as a misconception because I do get comments like this in my mentions. I would like to believe that this is coming from somebody with a genuine historic desire to know why we have been taught this way. However, I'll be honest, usually comments like this are a dog whistle for the individuals and factions that I talked about at the beginning of this video that like to use parts of the Crusades as an excuse to hate anybody that doesn't look or worship kind of like they do. And so I think it's important for us to address this misconception as well. Now, here's the thing. I think you can make a pretty fair case that some of the Crusades were a defensive conflict, specifically the Crusades in southern Spain into the tip of North Africa. This was a purely defensive battle by the Spanish and by their European allies to attempt to push Muslim communities out that had invaded over that period, and it culminates in the Reconquista. I do believe that for the most part, although there are atrocities on both sides, those are inexcusable, I do believe that this is a purely defensive conflict. However, that is where the good vibes end in terms of this quote-unquote needing more nuanced conversation. We've established pretty clearly that the trip to the Holy Land was long, cumbersome, risky, dangerous, expensive, and fraught with peril. And as a result, they're really only going there for one reason. Now, both factions, both Christian and Muslim, did, prior to the Crusades, launch some attacks and military expeditions into one another's lands, but nothing on this scope. And again, nothing that would truly require the kind of attack and response that the Crusades really and truly created. Again, you could potentially talk about Muslim pirates in the region. This is a picture of the Berbers, but the Berbers don't come into play until far after the Crusades. But there are, in fact, some instances of Muslim piracy on Christian lands. But again, even that's pretty questionable when you realize that the Norse had been doing the same thing even after they were Christianized, so to speak. So again, yeah, there's some areas of Muslim piracy, but hardly enough to launch the kind of invasion that the Crusades were. No, the truth is that despite the fact that there are individuals that try to whitewash, or at the very least excuse, hand wash away this kind of a global expedition, it really is not one brought on by Muslim or Arab attacks at all, or at least not enough of a way for me to think of it as historically significant. And truthfully, the people that suffer the most during the taking of Jerusalem and the Holy Land during the First Crusade, and who continue to suffer throughout all three Crusades, are innocents. One of the most harrowing accounts that you can read is the taking of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, where the Crusaders put everybody to the sword. If you have watched our video on knights, you will know that I have talked about this at length, but it is one of the greatest crimes of chivalry in the Middle Ages. One of the historians who actually spoke from firsthand knowledge, he was there at the event, a former knight who had sort of laid down his sword and taken up the life of monastic contemplation as penance for the things that he did on crusade, said that at one point the blood that ran in the streets flowed so freely and so highly that it reached to the top of the knees of a horse, and that included the women, the children, the old, and the sick. And particularly of interest, however, is that this violence really extended to Jewish communities in the Holy Land as well. Again, we have talked about anti-Semitism being a major force in the Middle Ages in our demons video, where a lot of Christian or medieval demon myths actually use Jewish or Jewish medieval stereotypes in how they're depicted and portrayed in stories, plays, and art. These Jewish communities, in fact, in some cases actually warned of the impending invasion of the Muslim areas. And again, this speaks to a greater issue. The Crusaders were there for money, and they really weren't sure or really weren't willing to take into account the lives of others in order to get it. Again, this is a blatant attack based solely on greed and power. And again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that other powers, and certainly the Muslim caliphates, did wage wars within their own lands with the very same motivations. The Mongols, the Huns, also waged war all the way up into Europe for the same motivations. But again, if we're not going to excuse the Muslim caliphates, if we're not going to excuse the Khans, we're also not going to excuse the Crusaders. I think that's just fair, and I think I judge all three of those types of things pretty harshly. So it's important for us to note, and again, to take into account that, yeah, for the most part, the Crusades, the Levant, the Holy Land, they were full of innocent people. And unfortunately, as much of a bummer as it is to bring this up now, those innocent people were the ones who bore the brunt of and the full pain of such an invasion. As an additional addendum, I will be including all of my sources at the end of the video, but if you're interested in learning a little bit more about how these communities individually were impacted, I do think these two sources are pretty decent. Full disclosure, I haven't finished reading these full sources, but I have found the parts that I have read to be useful and enjoyable, or at least as enjoyable as something like this can be, as something this serious can truly be as well. But if you're looking to learn a little bit more about this topic, I think this is a pretty good place to start. Let's go to misconception number 3, though, because boy, oh boy, do I need a breather after talking about something like that, because one of the biggest misconceptions is that these were homogenous communities. There is a perception, I think, in popular media that these are either mostly Muslim, mostly Arab, mostly Christian, or mostly Jewish, and the truth of the matter is, nothing could be further from the truth. See, we bandy about the term of melting pot, or a cultural melting pot, all the time, especially here in the United States, although I would argue we're more of a cultural salad bowl, right? You put a bunch of different cultures into one place, sure, but, you know, we might mix up, but we don't really absorb or sink into each other. But that's not really true in the Holy Land, in the Levant. Here is a true, genuine, multicultural melting pot experience, and it includes Christians, Muslims, and Jews who, by the way, are not homogenous even amongst themselves. There is an incredible interplay in Christian factions. One of the coolest things that I got to learn about throughout this was that there are different Christian sects, and the differences between those Christian sects were almost as pronounced as the difference between Shia and Muslim, or Shia and Sunni, Muslim majorities and minorities in certain sections of the Holy Land. I thought that was really neat and pretty nifty to realize. One of the coolest things that I actually read about was an account of a person named Michael the Syrian who called himself one of the country's patriarchs, which, by the way, many members of the Orthodox Church did not agree with. However, Michael the Syrian and other Orthodox leaders and other Frankish Catholic leaders were invited to the Lateran Council of 1179, where they discussed, guess what? The Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade. This is kind of like experiencing the NBA finals of religious warfare, only to find out that, like, everybody involved is doing the same thing. That is crazy work, to be completely and totally honest, and I'm kind of here for it. It's one of the cool parts about this system is this insane interplay. Many of the Christians in the Levant would be considered heretics in the West, and many of the Christians from the West would be considered heretics to the Christian Orthodox community or Catholic Orthodox community in the East. And yet, there is not only an intermingling of these faiths, but these faiths enjoyed intermarriages, these faiths enjoyed faith religious events, they even fought in each other's military orders. One of the sources that I actually read was about a Greek Orthodox priest who wished to be buried with Hospitaller honors because he fought with the Hospitallers. Like, it's so cool, or the Hospitallers, however you want to say it. But it's just such a cool thing to think about, that even the Christians in the Holy Land were not a homogenous group, and that they had this sort of deep level of nuance, and this very pragmatic notion of cooperation with one another and with the other faiths in the region, because they realize there is no ability to survive on their own. They have to ingratiate themselves not just with other Christian communities, but with other faith communities. And so what you have is a vibrant tapestry, a patchwork of different Christian religious beliefs, superstitions, and practices that sort of coincide with and meld and mesh with both Jewish and Islamic traditions. It's really interesting to think about that these Christians, who in many cases were seen as this, maybe the invader or like the conqueror in the minds of the West, but really were the friends and neighbors of the individuals in the East, in the Levant. I think that's really nifty. One of my favorite things that I read about during the course of this video, because I often think that Christianity and Catholicism, particularly in popular culture, gets painted with way too broad of a brush when there is so much depth and so much nuance and so much interesting things we can talk about when we talk about the followers of Christ in the Middle Ages. Arab and Muslim factions really were trying to work sometimes together, but sometimes apart for other goals. This is another thing, right? We talked about Sunni and Shia here in the modern era quite often, but those things were a big deal too. And there were multiple different Muslim caliphates and Muslim kingdoms that were competing for and vying for control of the Levant at the same time that the Crusaders invaded the region. Now, here's the other thing. These Muslims, despite the fact that they're being invaded, still worked in and worked with and cooperated in some cases, collaborated with Christian communities, because yes, they saw the Western invader as an invader, but the Christian communities that lived in places like Tyre or Cyprus or Antioch were still their friends and neighbors. And it's wild that in some cases Muslims shielded Christians who were the targets of Crusader violence, and those Christians would turn around and shield Muslims who were the target of Crusader violence. It's an insane symbiotic relationship that is sometimes contentious, but that does force these different religions to work together. And tying this all together is the Jewish communities of the Levant as well, where the Jewish communities often served as go-betweens and aides de camp for Muslim and Christian leaders. There are numerous accounts of Jewish physicians, Jewish advisors, and Jewish translators who would essentially not play both sides against each other, but would work with both sides in an effort to keep their communities safe from the wrath of both sides. It's insane that there is this very intricate, delicate political balancing act between these three factions that, again, even on the outside might seem homogenous to us, but were not homogenous even amongst themselves. Again, this is a deeply nuanced, diverse, and incredibly culturally rich period, both for Jewish communities and Islamic communities, and for Christians in the Holy Land in general. And from that vibrant, nuanced sort of dance politically emerges one of the most fascinating backdrops, I think, for role-playing games and just for historical study in general. What an amazing misconception to have. And again, if you're going to be making your games about the Crusades, please, for the love of all that is good and holy, no matter what you think is holy or what religion you think is holy, make these factions different within themselves. Lean in to how different and nuanced these people felt, the jobs that they did both to keep themselves safe and to keep others safe. And Misconception 4 is that both the defenders and the invaders of the Crusade were united. You would think that such an apocalyptic struggle like the Crusades would be an important thing, and you would be wrong, because apparently this cataclysmic war was still not enough to unite everybody. We're gonna start actually with the Muslims, because the Muslim empires, the big players in the region, use the Crusades as a tool to actually one-up each other. In many cases, massive Muslim caliphates would ally with or collaborate with invading Crusader armies or individual European powers, sometimes to disastrous results, in order to play them against their political rivals in the region. Those big ones that we're going to talk about, those ones that are sort of trying to play the Crusaders against them, are, of course, the Great Seljuks, which occupied this territory right here. That's the burnt orange-looking territory right there. The Seljuks of Rum, those would occupy this section right here, although, again, there is some overlap in these maps. Please know that there is some overlap. These territories were subject to change, but again, this is important to talk about. And finally, the Fatimid Empire, which stretches from the top of North Africa and a little bit into that area. So, important for us to think about, but these three powers often played not only against one another, but with the Crusaders. And although this was a thing that would presumably affect all of them, they really sort of treated it kind of like an excuse to bump off their Crusader enemies. There's so much division as well among the European powers. I talked at the beginning about the vast sums of wealth that poured out of the Holy Land at every turn. And as a result of this, you wanted to be the one that controlled the most important aspects and ports of those regions. lands, which means that yes, you were all presumably there for the same reasons. However, it also worked within your best interest to ally with Muslim powers in order to make sure that other crusaders or crusader states did not get the things that you wanted first. So this happened a lot. The Seljuks of Rum and the Fatimid Empire both tried to play European powers against one another, and European powers kind of were okay with it because it meant that they got stuff that their political and socioeconomic rivals didn't get, which is crazy work to think about. And this extends even to the rulers that remained in Europe. One of the biggest examples of this is the conflict between Pope Gregory IX and Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, who got excommunicated. Now, you would think that the king of the Holy Roman Empire, a warrior king at the time, would be someone you would want on your side, but they didn't like each other so much that it turned into a massive conflict and actually wound up with an entire Christian army, an imperialist Christian faction. I don't mean imperialist in that they are expansionist, although they were. I mean imperialist as in supporting the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire being pushed out of the Crusader lands, were wiped out entirely by Christian forces. And what's even more important than that is the factional conflict that happens after the Crusades kind of succeed. This is bonkers work, and I'm glad that we brought up Frederick II, because one of the important things that happens is that a lot of the time, the ones who won the Crusades, the ones who took over Crusader territories, were absentee monarchs. A lot of these monarchs would come in, they would take a Crusader city, loot it for all it was worth, and then go home, which meant there was a breakdown of state functions at the executive level, and so other powers would sweep in to control those factions, resulting in internecine political conflicts between what are essentially minor Crusader kingdoms within larger Crusader kingdoms ruled by absentee kings. Wild. This also extends to our good pals the Templars, the Hospitallers, and even the members of the Teutonic Knights. These people, despite the fact that they are all presumably religious orders, although cough cough, nudge nudge, wink wink, the Teutonic Knights fight in the Northern European campaigns against Lithuania, all of these people are presumably supposed to be working together, but as the Crusades extend in time, they all become vastly more powerful political and economic institutions, and then they start clashing. It is an insane time in medieval history, and it is one where no one is united, no one can agree on anything, and to quote the great video game donkey, everybody shoot everybody, Rainbow Six. That's truly what it's all about. But now that we've talked about the misconceptions, and boy howdy were there a lot of misconceptions, I get to talk to you about the important features if you're interested in running a tabletop RPG that is inspired by the Crusades, that is interested in getting the Crusades right. I think this is kind of a cheat sheet to help you really engage with those deeper themes of the Crusades and how to make them a part of your tabletop role-playing game. The first one I need to talk about is, again, that multicultural melting pot, the interplay between faith, between finance, and between these different cultures and how they shape each other. If you are building one of your things, you need to talk about this. And one of the things that I think is the most interesting, if we're going to delve into a single practice on how this melting pot is shaped, we're going to have to talk a little bit about Judeo-Arabic as a dialect. At the time of the Crusades, most of the Jews living in the Muslim caliphates spoke Arabic first as their fluent language and learned Hebrew as well. This meant that over time, Judeo-Arabic as a dialect was shaped, and it's its own unique language, which actually allows those Jewish people living in the region to communicate with Muslims on a different level because they kind of share the similar language. Again, we're going to go to the conjecture zone, but if one of my friends is a linguist, and so I could find no sources for this, but it's just something I thought I would bring up now because this is more about the game inspiration part of things. I think one of the cool things about dialects and language development is that the three things that you need from it is a massive social situation, it is time and exposure to other languages and cultures, and it's a chance for those things to grow, not necessarily in isolation, but in conjunction with world events. All of those three things take place during the Crusades. One of the ways that you as a game master could play around with this is in the development of new languages in a Crusader state kind of like the one that we had here. And again, although I could find no concrete evidence of this, I would be shocked if there was not some sort of dialect that forms. Also, something to make note of, didn't get its own slide, but French, particularly the early version of it brought over by Frankish Catholics, is the de facto bureaucratic language of the Crusader states. So again, you have a kind of Frankish Arabic thing that winds up developing an interplay between those languages, and I thought that was really neat. We're going to leave the conjecture zone though, and I need to talk about now how the Crusade was a massive spread of ideas across the East and the West. Now, if there's one positive that can be taken from the Crusades, and boy howdy, is it really hard to find a silver lining for a conflict like this one. If there's a silver lining, it is that this is a cataclysmic, not war, well, it is a cataclysmic war, but it's not just a cataclysmic war, it's a cataclysmic spread of ideas. The Muslims often are credited with the first credit card, which we bring back from the Crusades by the Templars, who later use a lot of the Muslim innovations in crediting and banking to become their own stalwart banking institution. But this street goes both ways, and we have a couple accounts of Muslim bankers taking practices and techniques brought on by Italian and Milanese bankers into their own systems. From this interplay creates a lot of the modern financial institutions that we have today. Again, the credit card starts here as a way of ensuring that your wealth can stay with you on your trip to the Holy Land, which is kind of interesting. We also have the Muslims to thank for algebra as well. It's something we got to bring back from Crusade, right? Algebra winds up taking over in most European universities, and as a result of that, results in a massive uptake of European mathematics and ideas, and the Europeans actually bring in some pretty interesting concepts as well to their Muslim counterparts. Things like siege engine development do help with things like engineering and physics, which again starts to take off in some Muslim areas. And lastly, we have to talk about philosophy. One of the greatest things, the greatest gifts of the Crusades to the Western world is the teachings of Aristotle and many of the philosophers whose works were thought lost after the loss of the Library of Alexandria. Many of the texts that we now enjoy in a modern philosophical curriculum were actually brought back from the Holy Land. Muslim scholars did a pretty decent job of preserving many of our greatest Western philosophers in their own universities, and when the Holy Land was sacked, Crusaders found these and brought these teachings back with them. If you love Aristotle or many of the Stoics, you probably have a Muslim scholar, a Muslim university to thank for that, because those individuals and institutions were the ones that safeguarded those things after the fall of the Library of Alexandria. If you're going to make the Crusades or a crusade-like war a part of your role-playing game, I think it's important to talk about how dramatically technology, culture, philosophy, mathematics, and learning change when there is that massive of an interplay of designs, ideas, and concepts between two different cultures. I think it's vastly important and very, very vital to consider to your role-playing games. Another thing that gets left out all of the time, and I want to talk about it now, is a focus on the sea. Usually when we conjure up battles about the Crusades or ideas about the Crusades, we tend to focus on these massive desert fights. However, that can't be further from the truth, because quite a lot of the Crusades was duked out on the open ocean. We talked about Muslim pirates before, and we talked about the importance of sea-based trade routes in the Levant. By the way, the Levant, I realize I've mentioned this a couple times now, is another name for the land that surrounds the Holy Land. Okay, cool, love it. But part of the things that we need to take into account is not just was not just that the Levant was a source of massive wealth from the ocean, but in many cases, it had no choice. A lot of the agriculture that you find in the Holy Land is in modern-day Syria, and by the time of the Second Crusade, much of that viable agricultural land is in the hands of Muslim territories and Muslim warriors. This means that in order to import the foodstuffs necessary to continue to keep the Crusader states functioning, you had to go through sea. So not only was this the lifeblood by which all of these Crusader states derived a frankly exorbitant amount of profit, it's also how they kept themselves alive by importing food. Again, from other places, usually like Egypt. However, Another important thing to take into account is because everybody knew this, a lot of the most prominent and important fights in the Crusades were on sea rather than in the desert. And it's really interesting. I love the idea of knight pirates or like crusader corsairs going around the ocean and battling to protect their trade routes, their supply lines, and the ports by which their reinforcements come in. If you're going to lean into a crusade-like campaign, I think you should have one that really does delve into the intricacies of naval combat and its importance in a region like this one. But also we have to talk that intrigue, backstabbing, and interscene civil conflict are critical to a crusade-based game. If you're really going to lean into this, you need to have battling between the factions, whether they are the invading factions or the defending ones, and boy oh boy, should there be a copious amount of backstabbing, backroom deals, assassinations, and just good old-fashioned skullduggery. It should feel like Game of Thrones on crack, if I'm being completely honest. Here's the thing, I feel like I cannot stress this enough, so I'm just going to say it one more time right here. If you are making a Crusades-themed campaign, the players should never truly know who their friends are, who their enemies are, and ally and enemy should switch from day to day. It is every organization for itself, and if the players want to succeed, they have to stop being a cog in the machine and become the one that cranks the machine themselves. I cannot stress it enough. It is critically important for you to make this a key feature of your games, and if I'm going to say there's one thing that is the most important thing about getting the vibe of the Crusades right, it is interscene, political conflict, civil strife, and a political level of backstabbing that you can only find in the Holy Land. And of course, what self-proclaimed fan of Medieval 2 Total War would I be if I didn't mention knightly orders and badass factions? Look, I know the Crusades are a horrific military time. They are a massive bummer to look at from a real, honest-to-God, empathetic lens. But if there's one defining characteristic of them, if there's one reason I think that we could say that the Crusades have lasted in the popular imagination, have become the subject of stories and games, it has to be the knightly orders. It has to be the monastic fighting orders of the Catholic Church, and we start with the greatest hit of all. Let's be real, it's the Templars. Look, if you have played Assassin's Creed, if you've queued up a Total War game, if you have played a tabletop historic game, you probably know the Knights Templar. They probably, truthfully, need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway because like a Krispy Kreme, I just can't stop glazing these people, man. I love the Knights Templar. They are one of the most fascinating organizations in medieval history, and perhaps in history in general. Not only did they have humble beginnings as a monastic order that was dedicated to the protection of pilgrims and holy sites within Jerusalem, they rose to become one of the most potent standing armies in the medieval world. They were, pound for pound, probably the best fighting forces throughout the First and Second Crusade, and even towards the end of their power at the Third Crusade. They were a behemoth banking institution, and all of that meant that the Knights Templar, if they had been able to carve out a stable empire of themselves, could have probably gone on to become their own sovereign nation. I genuinely believe that they had the ability to do so. Unfortunately, they are destroyed in a coup by the French crown. Man, the French are pretty good at taking out their own religious rivals and using religious pretexts to do it. That's pretty interesting. But yeah, the Templars are by far and large the most well-known faction of the Crusades. And we're going to go over some of my other ones because the Templars might be the greatest, but the Hospitallers are my favorite, or the Hospitallers. I think it's like a Caribbean thing. I think you can say it either way. I'm going to keep calling them Hospitallers anyway because I heard a British historian call them that once, and I think it sounds neat. The Hospitallers are my absolute favorite. There is something so iconic, so absolutely raw about the black robes, the white cross on it. I'm not going to lie, it goes hard. This is the medieval equivalent of Black Air Force energy. This is the medieval equivalent of the dude that rocks up wearing a black t-shirt and Tim's. You know that guy is going to throw down. No joke, every time. And the Hospitallers threw down. They began, as the name might suggest, running hospitals and sick beds for pilgrims. They later grew to protect the sick and the wounded in battles, and because, war is war. People often did not value that truce. The Hospitallers went from just guarding or caring for the sick during battles to guarding the sick to making sure that people were dead so that they couldn't hurt the sick to begin with. The Hospitallers are probably as close to a quote-unquote good monastic order that you have. Even as they grew in power, it seems like from the sources that I read, it seems like their major mission was still, obviously their major mission was power. All of their major missions are power. But they, out of all of the knightly orders, seemed to be the ones most grounded in retaining their original mission of protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. It's part of the reason they're my favorite. They're still around today, by the way, in a greatly diminished capacity. But again, I think they're awesome. Go Hospitallers. Shout out to Malta. These guys rock. They're my favorite. I'm not even going to pretend to be unbiased. Then we can talk a little bit about the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. You would be forgiven for not knowing them because the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre were one of the smallest orders, but they were also one of the most zealous because they're one of the orders that reports directly to the Pope. The Knights of the Holy Sepulchre were, shockingly enough, designed to protect the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and as a result spent most of their time as a defensive fighting force. They are still around. There are still 30,000 members of them as of today, and just like in the Crusades, they are still under the direct supervision of the Pontiff. That is kind of neat. I think these guys are kind of rad. And lastly, one of the most underrated, but one that I want to mention every single time, the Order of St. Lazarus. Another reason that I love the Hospitallers is that they kept up hospitals for lepers and people with highly infectious diseases. Over time, some of the Hospitaller members who were the caretakers of those sick and the dying contracted those illnesses themselves. And rather than wanting to die slowly because of sickness and disease, these men decided to take up metal and bronze masks, don their armor one last time, and fight to the end. It is awesome. Imagine for a moment you think you have got the better of somebody by removing a limb, and they just stand back up, start chanting in Latin, rip off this mask where you see basically a zombified face, and they go full tilt towards you with a mace or a battle axe. It is such a hard concept, man. I love the Order of St. Lazarus, and while the tales of their ferocity are much trumped up, I could find only one true anecdote of them actually fighting historically. It's such fertile ground for our imaginations that I can't help but include it here because, as I mentioned in our History and Horror Movies video that we did a couple weeks ago, this is such an incredible moment for an NPC or an antagonist in our role-playing games. And again, it is such a wonderful, wonderful little thing to sort of insert in your own games. I have to mention the Order of St. Lazarus here because, God almighty, I think they are just so menacing and so cool. And what a peak Catholic concept to decide that you want to die in combat for your fellows and you seek martyrdom not through sickness but through one final clash. It's just so metal and I absolutely love it. Finally, we come to the thing you've been waiting for: how to make the Crusades a part of your games. Although I would argue this entire video is a primer on the spirit, the history, and the nuance of the Crusades, so you could probably put that in your games. But if you're looking for specific rules and ideas, here are three that I think are pretty neat. The first one is I wanted to lean into the interplay of faith and finance, the, shall we say, religious fervor with which people fought for money. And so I have decided to, oh, by the way, this was a real quote that happened before a battle. This is insane levels of stuff. It just goes again to show the how quote-unquote religious this conflict truly was. But I wanted to talk about that interplay. I wanted to tie things in to the faith and finance angle. And so I have concocted the Eternal Debt, a knightly order that is dedicated to what is owed from above. These are people who are required to loot, religiously required to plunder, to pillage, to take what they can, and genuinely what they believe they're owed, and they build their armor from coins imbued with the souls of those they have destroyed. Now here's the thing: if you fail to loot enough, if you fail to take enough, you are destroyed, you perish, right? However, if you continue to loot, you continue to live this greed, you enter a state of eternal life as a gold-plated, fully sentient undead creature. You're immune to things that would usually destroy the undead because you still retain your religious affiliation. However, This is your afterlife. You have cashed in the promise of eternal salvation for the afterlife on Earth. And again, just like everything in this modern era, it comes with a subscription model, and if you can't keep it up, then you burst into that pile of precious gems, coins, and priceless works of art. This is my favorite thing. I cannot wait to run these guys in a game, but if you want to take them out for a spin, please, by all means, take my nightly order, The Eternal Debt, out for a little adventuring. Now, we also need to talk a lot about the importance of naval combat. This, by the way, is not a Crusader vessel. This is a Chinese vessel, a Chinese treasure barge, but it's very big, and I wanted to make something that's sort of behemoth-like, colossal. I really wanted to talk about the Devil's Spawn, which is a quote-unquote religious ship that's essentially a massive treasure galleon that was not transformed, but retrofitted essentially to become a kind of floating fortress, a bastion by which reinforcements or allies could sail down a river, or literally in some cases using the magic of the ship sail through land in order to reinforce an area. However, this indestructibility comes at a massive cost. You see, it's not really indestructible. Every time it would be destroyed or take damage that could potentially destroy it, it just sucks the life force out of one of the prisoners chained below decks. And although the players might think they're the good guys, they may wind up having to team up with their enemies in order to put this evil soul-eating ship to rest. And finally, the Levantine Blessing. This is a special executioner's sword, which I think is absolutely amazing. By the way, one of my favorite, and I do mean favorite, inscriptions on a sword is, though I end the life of the condemned, I wish them eternal life, which was found on an executioner's blade in the Holy Roman Empire, which is raw as hell. But again, this is kind of the opposite. I imagine this as a weapon that is imbued with the spirit of an executioner or a knight turned pacifist, and as a result, the Levantine Blessing functions as a regular sword, except anytime that you would do damage that just heals that much instead. Imagine being a fighter with a bunch of attacks and a high damage modifier. Imagine cleave healing your allies. That's crazy work. That's just amazing. I know this is like not a very like esoteric or story driven weapon, but I'll be honest, this is one of the funniest things I've made, and I absolutely love it because all I can picture is a fighter looking at a cleric and just be like, look at me, I am the cleric now. That's just awesome. But with that, my friends, it brings us to the end of our video today. I am going to do something that I don't usually do for Desks and Dorks videos. If you would like some further reading, these are the sources that I used for this video. I thought these were particularly helpful. They're not in any particular order, but I really did enjoy them. They were particularly useful to me. If you would like to help us out, if you like this kind of content, please consider backing us on Patreon. It is the single best way to help us out. You get, for $10 a month, you get early access to Desks and Dorks content, you get your name listed in the credits, which you're going to see the name of our patrons very soon, and you get one RPG a month. This month, it is 3 index card RPGs based on the folk horrors and folk tales of Appalachia. It's something I'm really proud of, but again, if you like this content, this took an exorbitant amount of time to make, a truly stupid, ridiculous amount of time to make. Please, if you want to support us, this is the best way to do it. The other best way to do it is, again, to purchase copies of our games from itch.io. That's a huge one. Or again, you can get them from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, or Exalted Funeral. And if you can't do any of them, I know times are super tough right now. Sharing the video is the single best way to help me out. Seriously, I cannot tell you how much sharing boosts a video like this into the YouTube algorithm. This video took legitimately about like 7 to 9 videos worth of effort to make, between the researching, the scripting, the actual editing of this process, and I cannot make videos like this often unless I'm getting the financial support from people who watch the videos. It's just a nature of the beast. And so please, if you like this kind of content, if you want to see this kind of content succeed and you can't vote with your wallet, a share goes a long way. But before we end our video, I have to thank our amazing patrons, Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, and Aiden Delaney. Gentlemen, thank you again so much for your support. It really does help make the world of difference to helping us make content quite like this one. As always, we will be doing a Q&A section, so if you had join the Discord, which is free, the link's in the description below, or if you commented in the YouTube community post, I will answer some questions that you have about the Crusades in our Q&A community section at the end of this video. But if you're here just for this part, then this is where we part ways. I am Kylot for Desks and Dorks. You have been absolutely amazing, and I will see you in the next one. Peace. Dad bod, we did it. We actually factually did it, guys. Oh, man. Well, I've cracked open a cold one. If this is your first time in the Q&A section, you'll know this is a little bit more off the cuff, a little bit more informal. It's just where I go through and I answer some questions. At the time of this recording, it is midnight. I work at 7. What do I work at 7 tomorrow? This probably will not be done until about 5 a.m. by the time that I'm done doing everything else. So I might need a crusade's worth of religion to save me. Let's jump into it. The Adjudicator asks, how do the Northern Crusades differ from earlier crusades, specifically between the Christian Teutonic Knights and Livonian Order versus the Lithuanian polytheism turned Christian Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Do they have similar economic and political reasons? Yes. I'll be honest. This was a section of the video that I did not add Adjudicator because you were looking at the runtime right now. And the runtime probably would have doubled if I'd gone in to the Northern Crusades, man. But just, I guess, to, sum it up loosely, Adjudicator. Yes, there were similar political economic reasons. I would argue the extremes of both ends, both political and economic and religious, are amped up. I think on some level there is sort of a grudging respect between the monotheistic religions of Islam, Judaism, and Catholicism. I know, at least when I was discerning the priesthood, one of the things that comes up a lot is that they're religions of the book, which, we actually share the same first 5 books of the Old Testament are the same books in the Torah, the Pentateuch, and the Quran makes sort of Islamic versions of those 5 books as well, I believe. Although I don't, maybe that's not true. Anyway, we share a lot of similar texts and similar religious figures, so I think there's a lot more respect between monotheistic religions than polytheistic ones, and the economic things are just massively amped up in that one. So I think it's everything the Crusades do normally. And cranked up to 11. Give me 2 seconds while I scroll to the top, y'all. Oh my god, there's so many questions. Holy god. Alright. Chris Bates, thank God for you, Chris, man. God love you, buddy. How many crusades were there? Proper ones, not just noble claiming holiday. At this point, I would consider the Albigensian Crusade one. There are multiple smaller crusades in North Africa, so maybe 4 there, technically. Then the 3 major ones, so that brings us to 7, 8. Then Sack of Constantinople is kind of its own crusade. Also kind of nobles on holiday, Chris. I'm just gonna say 10. I think it's somewhere in the double digits. And in terms of the time period, I was able to narrow it down for you at the beginning of the video. So I think that's a good one. And Chris also asked, did any of the North African skirmishes in the Spanish versus Saracens wars class as a crusade? I would say yes. I think you could consider all of the skirmishes together, Chris, at least multiple crusades, as we just sort of covered. But yeah, I think that entire period is sort of awash with all of this kind of stuff. So I think that's really, really interesting. And that's a good thing too. Lilliputian asks, what forces were commonly employed by the Crusades, and what were some unique, notable units during those times, like the Knights of St. Lazarus? Man, Lily, this is why I love you, dog. Of course you bring up the Knights of St. Lazarus, man. It's because you're OG as hell. No, so in terms of what is levied, it's important for us to think about, right? The rise of a professional army does not exist in Europe at the time of the Crusades. So this is still following the kind of feudal rules and feudal lawsuits or feudal rule sets that we talk about in the Knight video and in the Low Fantasy video. So it's very difficult for these communities to sort of raise a standardized army, and it's difficult for us to talk about them as standardized troops. One of the things that does come up often, though, is the importance of both light infantry and light cavalry, which, obviously there are heavy cavalry. The Seljuks obviously have multiple of them, and the Fatimids have their cataphracts, and obviously the Christians have their heavily guarded knights. But as the Crusades go on, lightly armored infantry becomes much, much more important. And what you find, actually, when you're reading these accounts, is that the Crusader states relied a lot on Muslim mercenaries, particularly to get their light cavalry. So it's really interesting that, much like the Romans before them, the Crusaders sort of rely on auxiliaries from the region that they're invading to sort of shore up the gaps in their own armor, particularly in the archer and light cavalry departments. But usually, Lily, what would happen is you would have the bulk of your force be infantry, usually light infantry, peasant conscripts, or mercenaries, auxiliaries hired from the region. You would have heavier men-at-arms or knight on foot to support. Then you would have your actual knights, usually light cavalry, again, auxiliaries or mercenaries, and then archers, either ones that you had brought in homegrown, or again, auxiliaries or mercenaries. I think it's a pretty good way of talking about it. And one of the knights, notable knight units, the Hospitallers, the Templars, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. We talked about all those. The Holy Roman Emperor brought his own personal bodyguard. Barbarossa was, despite the fact that he drowned in like 2 inches of water, or like 4 inches of water, despite that happened. That dude's like elite shock troop bodyguard was like an actual menace on the battlefield, so that's kind of cool. Sir Loxodon Prince, not to get too deep into alternate history vibes here. Oh boy, as we about to get deep into alternate history vibes here, I'm gonna take a swig. I would encourage all of you to do so as well if you're having a beverage at home. But what do you think the greater impacts were from the Crusades acting against the Byzantines? And to add to that, what do you think a pro-Byzantine divergence would look like, prioritizing gaining tributes and riches from the Byzantines by helping reconsider and squash the very pagan and Muslim Turkic peoples moving into the Byzantine territory? It is going to... not necessarily the Byzantines. I know this isn't really your question, Loxodon Prince, but I genuinely think a lot of the mess in the modern Middle East is, like, created by the Crusades. Because we talked about the nuance and the interplay between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish culture in the Middle East. But, like, that goes away after the Crusades. And I often wonder if a lot of the geopolitical events happening right now, that one war that we're not allowed to mention, because YouTube actually does shadow ban this. It's been publicly documented, which sucks because it'd be nice to talk about it. But like that war, I don't know if it comes to pass in quite the same way, because there is that sort of interplay of an important cooperation and collaboration between those three cultures in that region. In terms of like the Byzantine thing, it would be interesting to see how the Byzantines would play out, although I have to be completely honest, I don't think the Byzantines were long for that world. I don't think, with the way that the Byzantine culture operated, I don't think they were going to last forever. Someone was going to oust them off of that trade position, right? Like the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits are so important, like historically and like militarily for trade. And the Byzantines just didn't really play ball in the kind of ways that like maybe somebody like the Swiss would have in that region. I think their fall, I don't want to say their fall is inevitable, but I do think it's likely regardless of whether or not they get the help in that time period. So, Mr. Squid, I think if we're covering the Crusades, a mention of Trench Crusade would be nice. I have mentioned it. No, I mean, I like Trench Crusade, Mr. Squid. I think it's like one of the coolest things. I was geeking out over the whole thing. My brother got a 3D printer and has been printing a bunch, and I had considered backing the Kickstarter, but I need more games. Like, I need a hole in the head, as I'm like currently culling my collection. And I think if we're talking about the Crusades, I don't think Trench Crusade actually does a good job of mattering. Now, I know that it's related to the Crusades. Obviously, I watched the lore videos and I read everything about it. And like, yeah, like it definitely is tangentially connected to the Crusades. Like the idea that this whole thing starts when the Templars are corrupted horribly. But let's be real here for a second. In its current iteration, the Trench Crusade has so much more in common with World War I, I feel. It is, however, badass as hell, and I freaking love it. Shop Vac, IDK if you'll answer this in the video itself, but what usually drives people to go on a crusade? Obvious religious figure calls for one, but what makes a noble or peasant? Money. Money, 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 money. I like money. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Money and power, Shop Vac. Money and power, my boy. Yeah, I mean, like, again, like, we did talk about it in the video. It was fairly nuanced, but, like, yeah, like, I mean, it's think about it, like you have no social mobility, you have very little opportunity, And you have this idea that like imagine you have an example, like your life is pretty rough in a lot of ways. And then somebody comes along and gives you a coin and they're like, hey, 50-50 chance that you die horribly or you come back with riches beyond your wildest dreams. I know a lot of people who would take that coin flip. And that's kind of what it was, which I'm oversimplifying it drastically, but obviously there's like a 2-hour-long video of nuance. So, but yeah, I think that's it. Masked Bandit, who is the greatest warrior or leader to stand up against the Crusades? Saladin. Saladin is massive. I didn't even talk about Saladin. Oh, I did not even talk about Saladin. Oh, man. Okay. I'm not going back and doing that again. It's annoying as crap. But yeah, Saladin, Masked Bandit. And I think, so like there's a lot to unpack with Saladin. Like he is an incredible statesman, an absolute behemoth of a tactician. But like the thing that he's the best at is getting the Muslim factions to stop murdering each other and using the Crusaders as pawns, quote unquote, in their plans. There's a whole emerging school of Muslim military history that talks about how it's the political divide between the Muslims that helps contribute to the Crusader success. And I feel like that's pretty likely. I don't like some people are like, oh no, it's the only reason for the Crusader success. No, that I disagree with. Some of the Crusaders had insane tactics and incredible warriors. Like it's really hard to understate how powerful the Templars and the Hospitallers, particularly as knightly orders, were at the time. But Saladin makes a great job of figuring out and getting those disparate, different factions to work together in ways that are really beneficial for the Muslim world. So I think that's true. Carl said there's as many answers to that as why there are people on crusade. Louis IX went out of religious devotion. Some of his vassals went out of obligation and money. It's a combination of all of these in most cases. I would say yes, Carl. I think it's a great way of putting it. Although I will say, I think the higher up you get, the more it's about Zimula. And then he said, it's a toss-up between Enrico Dandolo and Saladin. Yeah, Enrico Dandolo, I guess, is technically against the Crusades in that so far that he burnt the biggest and most powerful city in Christendom at the time to the ground. So I guess Enrico Dandolo does kind of make the Venetians sort of a warrior for the cause, as it were. But yeah, Saladin. Rules. To add to this, Carl mentioned Frederick II. Yeah, and he went under excommunication. He absolutely did, which was a big deal. Yeah, Frederick II could have also gotten a video all his own, because let's be real, Frederick II just basically did whatever he wants. Like the Dos Equis man of like the medieval world. It's kind of crazy. The T-Man mentions, right, were there any stereotypes from that time that we know about the Crusaders, depending on where from Europe they came from? Do we have any interesting interactions between Crusaders from different cultures? Yes, we do. Small stuff like that. I like learning about history. Yeah, of course, man. So I mentioned earlier that there was a Greek Orthodox priest that fought alongside the Hospitallers and wanted to be buried with the Hospitallers, which I thought was kind of neat. One of the most interesting figures, and I'm going to butcher his name. I believe it is Salim Alik. Oh man, that's such a hard name. He was a Syrian soldier, warrior, poet, which is and statesman, which was crazy. And yeah, he fought against the Crusades. He was an advisor to numerous different Syrian and Muslim powers, and he counted the Crusaders as his friends. Like, that he has like poems about them, which is crazy. I will, if I remember T-Man, I will try my best to put his real name and a link to him in the Discord. He was going to get his own section. I had to cut it for time. And also just in general, the section didn't flow very well. But yeah, like despite the fact that he fought against them on numerous occasions, he counted several, like, not like high echelon members, but like ranking members of Crusader armies as his friends. And to my knowledge, they counted him as their friend too. Which is kind of cool. It was sort of that like real recognize real moment. I know I'm drawing a lot of like NBA analogies, but like it kind of reminds me how like Kobe and Michael Jordan freaking hated each other. And then afterwards they're like, yo, we love you. Or like maybe Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson's probably a better analogy, because MJ was on his way out when Kobe was kind of really truly hitting his stride. Masked Bandit, what was the greatest accomplishment or change that resulted from the Crusades? The spread of algebra and the recovery of philosophical ideas and texts from the Library of Alexandria. That is... Oh boy. Restating this so I don't get lost. Sir Luxon Prince asked, but what is the biggest they should have won moment? Oh boy. I don't actually know. That's a good question. Dang, I'm not trying to think about that. Like, what is the biggest they should have won moment? Maybe not a battle. I really don't think the fact that Barbarossa drowns in 4 inches of water and like changes the scope of German history is crazy work to me. So I don't know. I would say I think Loxodon Prince that is my like, yeah. I would say that's like not a they should have won, but like they should have lived a moment. Yeah, I'm gonna say that. Oh, also one more thing to Mass Bandit in terms of like who was the best person that fought against the Crusades. If we're talking one of the people that fought for the Crusades, Sir William Marshall, the Lance of Christendom, is somebody I'm going to do a video on at some point. He is the greatest knight ever, and at like 65, he was fighting in the Crusades and took a gatehouse by himself because one of his knights was injured and couldn't escape. The dude was 65. He was nuts, dude. He's basically Rambo in armor. It's crazy. Arcane Bard. It seems like a lot of people aren't aware that the Northern Crusades against the last holdouts of paganism in Europe, along with some of the Crusades that were against heretics, such as the Cathars. Hey, we mentioned those. What do you think would be the long-running political effects of similar Crusades if they would have failed? Ooh, if they would have failed. Alternate history, baby. Yeah, if they would have failed is really different. The paganism one, I don't think matters nearly as much. I think it eventually peters out as a folk tradition, and if he peters out and becomes folk traditions, even if it doesn't end violently. Although, who knows, maybe spurred on by a victory against major crusading powers, maybe paganism becomes a actual force within those kingdoms. But I doubt it. I think a lot of the Christian nations would have attempted to exterminate that country as a response to that. So I think eventually, like in the case of the pagans, I think it happens to like what happens to the Mongols. The Mongols eventually get Christianized, and Mongol beliefs wind up getting subsumed into the background, so to speak. So I think that's kind of part of it. Now, granted, if the Albigensian Crusade fails, oh boy, does that change some stuff, because I have no idea what happens then. There is a very real, very distinct possibility, right, that sect of Catholicism gains traction, particularly if the leaders of the County of Toulouse are able to extend and defeat the French monarchy afterwards. It is entirely possible and plausible that like the two popes thing that we have, we get absolutely like a totally different Catholic branch in France. That would be really interesting. I think it'd be cool. Arcane Bard, Sir Loxodon Prince, not gonna lie, the Crusades bum me out. Northern Crusades are a great example of why. Yeah, they're a bummer. I mean, like they're cool to talk about because like it's a high time of adventure and grand battles and these cool knights. But like, yeah, I mean, if you have basic empathy, this shit sucks. Like, I mean, you know, we're not gonna mince hairs about it. Arcane Bard, yeah, though a contrast with other religious-based wars makes it interesting, a lot of them do seem to be way more political than about religion. Thinking of that, how would a crusade-like effort work in a non-monotheistic religion? Interestingly enough, we have an example of this in fiction. I think George R.R. Martin does it really well with the Andals and the invasion of Westeros. Not a full-on crusade necessarily, but the Andals like worship the Seven, right? A seven-partite god essentially, and I think it works essentially the same way. It's just that those gods exemplify different parts of the crusade. This is anecdotally, and again, we're into the conjecture zone here. But like in my reading of like Hindu religious wars, a lot of times like the different aspects of Vishnu, for example, get roped up into different aspects of military life and conquest. So my guess is they play out similarly, but that the different polytheistic gods do different things. Yes, sir. McGill asked, the economic and logistical needs to support crusading armies must have been massive. How were these financed, and what was public opinion like as all this wealth was, I assume, squandered? TLDR, can you confirm or deny this meme? The world if no crusades, and it's like something straight out of the Jetsons. So the way they were financed is massive loans. Sometimes these loans were from the church. Sometimes these loans were from private citizens like Enrico Danilo, or sometimes these loans were self-financed, or sometimes these expeditions were self-financed. The ones that weren't self-financed, the quote-unquote Children's Crusade or the Peasants' Crusade, fail horribly. because they basically just die of starvation and exposure, like literally halfway into the journey. In terms of like the wealth was squandered, it depends, because the wealth wasn't always squandered. Like we talked about Venice, but like Enrico Dandolo's loot from that campaign basically provides an economic foundation with which Venice controls all of the like Renaissance world for like 50 years, 60 years. It's like, it's insane, right? So, and some of it too leads to major banking institutions that are still around today. So some of it's not totally squandered, which I think is important. Langrig Tuig has been basically had a nice, very long rant about why the Crusades are all about economics, and you are absolutely correct, sir. I'm not going to go over the whole rant, but yes, it is a huge thing. Ignacio, imagine you were making a TTRPG about the traveling parts of the Crusades, an Oregon Trail game of sorts. How would it feel like, and what would be your short and medium term goals in the game? Yes, Ignacio. Bro, this is such a good question. If I'm gonna make it like that, I think, okay, how would it feel like? Your goal would be to get to Jerusalem. So like, there's two ways of doing this. One goal would be just do the pilgrimage, right? Like try to get to Jerusalem in one piece and survive. The other way you could do this is try to get to Jerusalem and slowly build up an army as you get there, which is how some of the Crusades happened. You'd start with a small force and you would gain momentum as you would go. So I'm going to do that one because it's more ambitious. I think you're essentially as a push your luck game where you're constantly balancing the supplies that you need to gather with the amount of soldiers you need to win the game at the end. Because if you get there with all these supplies and not enough guys, you lose. If you get there with, or if you fail to get there at all because of the lack of supplies, doesn't matter how many guys you've got to help you take the city. That's how I would do it. Yeah, I love it. Carl, still the question of why Crusades happen is very different from the question of why one goes on crusade. Yesn't. I think, again, like you said, it's nuanced a little bit more nuanced, but a little bit more nuanced than that. And now, Ignacio, maybe another Patreon game will be me making the Crusades. Carl, you do bring up a great point, though, about prestige. It's something that I failed to take into account in my video. Like the Pope being able to, the Pope giving out the prestige would be important. Would truly religious motivated wars ever exist in a role-playing game? Langrig asked this. And Langrig, if I'm saying your name wrong, please correct me. Please give me a phonetic pronunciation. I'm so sorry. I am so tired. Would a religiously motivated war exist in a role-playing game? Yeah. Absolutely, I think it would, right? There used to be a joke D&D sketch podcast, and like one of the characters just goes, I've learned two things: multi-class, one level, and everything, and your base saves are nuts, because it was 3.5, so you got the base save. And atheism is stupid. I'd worship 17 gods, and they all love me. I just think it's that. But yeah, I mean, I think it totally would, right? Like Dark Sun, which is arguably one of the most interesting D&D settings of all time, is I feel like a purely religiously motivated setting, right? Yeah, gods are a real thing that could change anything. It would be interesting though, Larry, if the gods are forced to bow out in the event of a crusade. Imagine the gods, basically the Crusades are one big bet from the divines, and they're we're just gonna let the mortals suss this one out themselves. How crazy would that be? I would love that, man. That would be incredible. Yeah, I think it's a good call. Dreaming of a white Christmas. Okay, that is all of the ones from the Discord. Oh boy, whew. Y'all, that was a lot. Take a breather. Take a couple seconds. Stretch your shoulders out. If you're still with us, my God. If you're still with us, man, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here. Y'all are great. I'm just going to go back here. Double check my questions. Oh, yeah, we have a new Pope today. That's crazy work. Can I just say for a second how excited I am? As a Catholic, we have a new Pope. And, it's a good Pope, too. This is a guy who spent, the majority of his life fighting for the rights of the poor and the sick. That makes me just jazzed. I'm so stoked. We have a good Pope, man. That's awesome. He's a mendicant, too. For those of you not in the know, mendicants are people who swear vows of poverty to try to take care of folks. And I love this. I love it. It's one of my favorite things. So, yeah, I adored I adore. Adore, adore, adore. It's an American Pope too, which I care about a little bit, but like not nearly as much as I care about the fact that this is a dude fighting for the rights of the disenfranchised for like his entire career, which is based AF. So I am optimistic. It seems like too he was a big follower of Pope Francis, and I'm a big fan of Pope Francis, as I am a fan of most Franciscans and most Jesuits. I have a Franciscan monk friend, by the way. I met him in college, which is cool, when he was discerning his priesthood, which is awesome. Love Brother Mike. Brother Mike rules. I knew him. He was just Mike. Just Mikey. All right. Delta Kane. I've always wondered what life was like in the Hospitallers, especially the non-knight brothers in arms that accompanied them in history. Man, I love this question because, again, I love the Hospitallers. It is my favorite part about them. So, from most of the... Again, this is not the whole focus of the video, Delta Kane, so please take all of the things I'm about to say with a huge grain of salt, because a lot of this is based on my anecdotal knowledge. So, from my understanding, the life of the Hospitaller was spent sort of 50-50 on the battlefield and traveling to battle, and 50% in their institutions of care. So, a lot of the knights who fought also helped in the day-to-day administration and running of their hospitals. So I imagine it would be like Grey's Anatomy, but with a lot more swords. It should be sweet. Also, the brothers in arms that served with them, the Hospitallers were pretty famous for that, like having a bunch of like, not hangers-on, but like lesser trained men-at-arms who were still pretty capable in a fight. And for the most part, it seems like they were treated pretty well. But much like the Hospitallers, they were also expected to carry out duties in the hospitals and also to carry out duties on the battlefield, which I think is pretty interesting. So, Pelagius the Great, I believe you already went over the psychology or the combat psychology that produced the class of warriors called knights, but if you didn't, could you possibly touch on that in this video? We did do this in the video, but one of the things that I would like to take into account in terms of combat psychology is that these knights, particularly the religious knights, the training for knighthood starts very early, so you're kind of ingrained in this warrior mindset, and that gives you the skills and experience that you need to succeed on the battlefield. That is shored up by the sense of religious zeal. It's part of the reason that why these knights are so effective. This is a group for whom religion does matter quite a bit, right? I will say that one of the things that I think we need to take into account, though, is that even in hyper-religious warrior groups, PTSD is still a huge deal. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is like when you read the Old Testament, one of the coolest classes I ever took when I was in college, because I went to a Catholic university, was a whole thing on like historical biblical scholarship. And one of the things that they brought up during the course is there's a section of Judges that talks about how after Gideon and the Israelites cleanse the Canaanites out of their land, i.e. remove them creatively from the life stream, they take time to quote unquote like think deeply and cleanse their souls. And it was literally like most of the research that they were doing was talking about how like this form of like active meditation and anxiety management was probably a natural response to the PTSD of having to remove non-combatants like women and children from the live stream in the way that they did. So I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah. So that's a neat way to think about it. But yeah, I think it's pretty cool. And with that, oh, and one more person just said, this dude's been reading my mind or some shit. I have been working on a TTRPG setting that's basically a fantasy blend of the Iron Age and the Crusades, and this MF just happens to start making videos about those two things like few months after I find his channel. Hell yeah. Well, Sterling9314, you're welcome, my dog. And also, I live in your walls. And with that, my friends, this video on the Crusades has been completed. I sincerely appreciate all of the love and the support. Again, please, the Patreon link is right there. If you would find it in your hearts to back at the Patreon level, that would be cool. If not, that's fine. I love you all anyway. But share the video, please, because at this point, this is like the biggest, most exorbitantly done video that Desks and Dorks has ever produced. And I would like it to do the commensurate numbers, because if it doesn't, then I will never make one like this again, probably. And I would hate that, because this was super fun. But with that, I'm Kyle off for Desks and Dorks. You guys are awesome. I'll see you in the next time. Peace.